We're back on NewsWire. Pleased to welcome in someone that you are very familiar with from watching, listening to SportsGrid. Of course, comes your way on weekends frequently. A whole lot of fantasy talk round the clock, and that is Joe Pisapia from Betting Pros, Fantasy Pros. Joe, how are you?
Oh, good to see you, Mr. Kaufman. A wonderful fill-in for Craig Mish and somebody with a much lighter energy. You know, Craig's very heavy sometimes, especially on a Tuesday. It's nice to have some light, airy energy with Adam Kaufman, and I think the audience agrees.
I would like to record that, play it for my wife so that she knows that this is how people perceive
Let's
me
not push it too far,
outside of the
Kaufman.
home. Yeah, that's right.
Let's not
All
push
right,
it too
let's get
far.
into
Okay.
some week 2 winners from, the second week of fantasy here in the NFL, because it was a fun week. A lot of the chalk hit obviously, but when it comes to sort of what we have in front of us as well, a lot of injuries to think about going forward. But right out of week 2, who stood out to you?
Well, look, I think one of the biggest questions everybody had was, what's this Seattle backfield look like? And I warned everybody. I said, week 1, you have to kind of pump the brakes a little bit because these running backs aren't up to their regular speed necessarily. They're still kind of ramping up. They haven't played full games yet. So sometimes you see a lot of split backfields, and sometimes in fantasy, we can overreact to them. We did hear a lot about Charbonnet this offseason, how he's going to have a bigger role. So I think that combination was a bad feeling for a lot of people who had Ken Walker. Well, I think after this past week, we can push that aside. 13 carries for 105 yards and a touchdown. He also had 1 reception in that game. So he finished as RB5 on the day. A pretty good situation here for him. And then you have, this year's Sam Darnold, dare I say, in Daniel Jones, where things are really starting to cook right now for this Colts team. I think that Daniel Jones looks very comfortable. Shane Steichen's a good offensive mind. He got to the playoffs with Gardner Minshew a couple of years ago. I think people forget that. So Daniel Jones' reclamation project is in full swing. Sure, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. The Colts came away with a W there at the end, and a game they probably should not have won, but a W is a W. But from a fantasy perspective, he's got 3 rushing touchdowns. He's number 2 right now in fantasy points per game for the first 2 games. He's right behind only Lamar Jackson. Now, is that sustainable? Probably not. But at the same time, it has to be acknowledged that, especially in these single quarterback leagues where you've had a lot of injuries like Fields, Burrow, we might not have Jaden Daniels this week. Daniel Jones is floating on a lot of waiver wires and should be added. And of course, the Lions defense to bounce back. I talked about it all day on Sunday on the show. At home against Ben Johnson, they will bounce back and bounce back in a big way. Throw all your Lions out there. And if you did, chances are you had a pretty good day because those were the winners from week 2.
Lions 334 passing yards, obviously coming from Jared Goff, 5 passing touchdowns, 177 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. I'll be honest, I was one of the skeptics, obviously believing Detroit was going to win, but not necessarily knowing what we were going to get off of such a disappointing first game with a new offensive coordinator, and then going up against, as you said, Ben Johnson, who, if anyone outside that organization knows them inside and out, it's Ben Johnson. So would he find a way to slow down that offense, or the defense for that matter, take advantage of it? He didn't in any way, shape, or form. So it's like,
Nope.
Super Bowl tickets, all that stuff for the Lions. The road is back on, obviously, for a lot of people out there. I am wondering, though, going forward, are the Lions, from a fantasy perspective, more like what we saw against Chicago or more like what we saw against Green Bay?
Well, somewhere in between. Whenever the Lions are at home, that's where Jared Goff does his best work. As I always call him, he's the indoor cat of the NFL. He likes it inside. He doesn't like it outside. He wants to be inside where it's cozy and temperature controlled, and Jared Goff excels there. I do think, though, as the time goes on, it's going to be difficult here for the Lions because when you lose your offensive coordinator, your defensive coordinator, and your offensive passing game guy as well, and Tanner Engstrom, you're going to lose a lot of continuity. And I think that's going to show up against some of the better teams. It wasn't going to show up at home against the Bears because Caleb Williams will always be a hot mess. That's right. I said it. And I think until they make a quarterback change there, they're not going anywhere either. So I think the Lions, again, it's kind of pick and choose your week carefully. But when they're at home from a fantasy perspective, all in.
So you hit some week 2 fantasy winners. When it comes to the other side of the ledger, the week 2 losers, there's an injured QB. There's also a guy who might still be reading War and Peace on the sidelines. I'm not sure. Tell us about these fellas.
Yeah, look, we got to start with the biggest loser this week is definitely anybody who had Joe Burrow, and in Superflex leagues especially, because it's one thing in a single QB league. Maybe Trevor Lawrence is out there. Daniel Jones could be floating out there. People didn't believe in week 1. That's fair. they've seen Daniel Jones play football for most of his career. But in Superflex leagues where Joe Burrow was a top 5 pick, this is kind of crushing. Now, the good news is Jake Browning is out there, and the other good news is that it wasn't the only quarterback injury. So you're going to have Carson Wentz start. You're going to have Mac Jones maybe still floating out there potentially if the Brock Purdy manager didn't pick him up. You may even have Tyrod Taylor this week. You could have Marcus Mariota, but you might be better off just probably starting another wide receiver as opposed to Mariota. However, Jake Browning, I do want to bring some attention to. In 5 of his 8 starts in 2023, he finished as a QB1. Jake Browning's going to have Chase, Higgins, Chase Brown. He's going to have the full complement of weapons. He's been in this Zach Taylor offense forever. I think you can actually go out there and be competitive with Jake Browning. And I know it's going to sound crazy, but if you go back and look at the game log, he struggled twice against Pittsburgh. 2023, that Pittsburgh defense was pretty good. And he struggled against the Baltimore Ravens, where most teams would struggle. Other than that, he was a QB1. The guy utilizes the weapons. Is it always pretty? No. But even in this past weekend, you saw he could get the job done. Then you mentioned our favorite book club member, A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, still a quiet beginning to the season. We have to wonder, is he 100% healthy? We know he had an injury at the end of camp, and so far it doesn't look great. The whole offense just seems still out of sync to me with the Eagles. We'll see what they do this week. And, when it comes to some of the biggest losers of the week, too, I think you also have to talk about the Dolphins because Mike McDaniel is not long for this world. I thought he would definitely be gone by the bye week. I'd be shocked if he was still coaching them October 1st. And now they have a short week.
Friday morning.
They have to travel. Well, I don't think you're wrong. Short week traveling to Buffalo is not the recipe to turn things around.
No, Friday morning, mini bye, long time for the next guy to get a plan in place for week 4. I think that's what we're headed toward. And I like Mike McDaniel just as a dude. He's just not proven to be obviously a very good coach there in Miami. So with the time that we have, let's get to some preferred waiver wire targets. You mentioned obviously Daniel Jones, the guy that people should consider snatching up if they need a quarterback. Jake Browning being a viable target as well. Where else are we going?
Yeah, look, those are the first 2 quarterbacks I think you're looking to. And I definitely think Daniel Jones probably your number 1 go-to guy on the waiver wire. And he's still available in 70% of leagues. And that 35% roster percentage you see on the consensus of Fantasy Pros, that's taking into account all of these Superflex leagues. So really in single QB leagues, he's widely available. Bashal Tutin and Cedric Tillman still under 50% rostered. Why, I don't understand. I keep screaming about Cedric Tillman for, weeks now. Even before the season started, not only should you draft him, you should pick him up. And he's still floating out there. Tutin, again, it's not like you have to, but I think it's a good idea to roster him. He's still under rostered. Blake Corum, probably one of the better handcuffs. If you have Kyren Williams especially, it's not that I want to take too much out of last week, what I saw. I do want to just say that from a running back perspective, if something happened to Kyren Williams, Corum looks like he's capable of filling in. And then, of course, you can look to some of those Washington running backs as well, McNichols and Rodriguez. Rodriguez, probably more of the goal line back, but neither of these guys are thrilling. This is more of a deep cut, I think, for those deeper leagues. If you look to the wide receivers, Alec Ayamanor, another guy that I talked about all offseason, talked about him in draft season. He was one of my favorite sleeper guys, and he looks pretty good. Came away with a touchdown this week. To me, he is the clear number 2 in this offense behind Calvin Ridley. And who knows, maybe at some point he even overtakes him. Wan'Dale Robinson, this is a trap, I think. I mean, a low ADOT player for years and years. Sure, the Giants offense hasn't been great. Last week feels like an anomaly, but if you're desperate for wide receiver, you could look for help there. The Green Bay Packers, Romeo Doubs, 23% rostered. Another situation where they're just looking for live bodies at this point. And then Troy Franklin and Isaac Tesla. Tesla, again, more of a 14-team ad, but every time he makes one of these circus catches, it just kind of pops. And if anything should happen to Amon-Ra or J-Mo, Tesla is really interesting. Troy Franklin has that continuity with Bo Nix from college. We saw a tease of it last year. It looks like we might be seeing the full version of it in 2025.
I'm not just saying this because he was nice to me earlier. Of all the people that join us on these shows, Joe, I might like your background the best. There's a lot of energy there in that background. Really. I love, maybe I'm partial to bobbleheads is a big part of it too. Joe Pisapia, Fantasy Pros, Betting Pros on Twitter, Joe Pisapia and the number 17. See you, buddy.